the risk of nuclear war in particular is back. It's coming back into center stage. I mean, I don't think the penny has yet fully dropped.
If the United States initiates nuclear use against Russia, it is risking its own survival.
It's perfectly credible for Russia to threaten to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, knowing that the United States will not retaliate. They know Ukraine does not matter to the United States enough for them to be able to credibly threaten nuclear retaliation. And we saw this at work when Ukraine's very successful counteroffensives threatened to really roll up the Russian positions. As we now know from Bob Woodward's book, the Americans assessed there was a 50% chance that Putin would use nuclear weapons.
Тем, кто позволяет себе такие заявления в отношении России, хочу напомнить, что наша страна также располагает различными средствами поражения. Это не блеф.
In the end, the problem went away because the Russian forces held, the Ukrainian offensives ran out of steam. But had that not happened, then the risk of Putin going nuclear would have been very high. And he knew, because Joe Biden had told him, that the Americans would not use nuclear weapons to retaliate. Because Biden, all the way back in 2021, when the fears of the Russian invasion of Ukraine were growing, said America will not fight World War III in Ukraine.
We will not fight the Third World War in Ukraine.
Let's look at the two big theatres, if I can put it this way. There's the Russian challenge to America's position in Europe and the Chinese challenge to America's position in East Asia. One of the characteristics of a great power is that it claims for itself a sphere of influence. It claims for itself an area around its borders from which it purports to exclude other great powers. Now, that's what other countries wanted to claim too. What Russia was doing under Putin, Russia has been asserting its right to a sphere of influence in its near abroad. China is doing exactly the same in East Asia. What China seeks to do is to push the United States out of East Asia and take its place as the region's leading power. If the United States no longer plays that role in Europe and in Asia, then it can't claim to do it globally. Both those challenges are succeeding. As China's challenge has picked up, become more intense, the United States faced a choice. It could either push back decisively or it could acquiesce in China's bid to push it out. Barack Obama came talking about America being all in to preserve its position as a leading power in East Asia. And then the Biden administration came back in and talked a lot about pushing back against China.
We'll confront China's economic abuses, counter its aggressive, coercive action to push back.
But if you look at what America actually did, the answer is just about nothing. Have you seen any US political leader stand up and say, in order to preserve our position vis-a-vis China, we need to be prepared to fight a nuclear war with China, which would involve nuclear attacks on American cities? Until they say that, I won't take them seriously. Because that's what they said in the Cold War. When Kennedy confronted Khrushchev over Berlin in 1961, he went on national television and said, we will defend West Berlin, and if necessary, we'll fight a nuclear war to do it, and this might mean nuclear attacks on American cities. That's leadership.
We cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of Berlin, either gradually or by force.
No one in America talks like that about China today, and that's why I don't take them very seriously. During the Cold War, there was a very clear answer as to why it was necessary for America to do that, and which mobilized the American to spend for decades, in the 50s, 10% of GDP on defense. I'm entirely unpersuaded there is anything in current US political leadership recognizes what would be necessary to mobilize not a rhetorical, but a genuine strategic confrontation of China, and can explain why it's worth doing. I don't think it is. The Trump phenomenon, Trump's revolution in American politics, is extremely important. The first is that he doesn't like dependence. He doesn't like weak people. But he does quite like strong people. He likes Putin and Xi more than he likes his allies, what he would see as mendicant allies who can't be bothered defending themselves.
If you're not going to pay your bills, we're not going to defend you.
What Trump thinks does seem to fit with what most Americans think. Iraq and Afghanistan convinced a lot of Americans outside the Beltway that this was not cheap and easy. And if you think that was too much, imagine what a war with China or Russia would be like. Can one expect to take on not just the burdens of running a bit of an aid program, but launch the entire country into a nation-defining struggle, which will cost the lives of tens or hundreds of thousands? What we've seen is that the idea that America should function as the global leader is unsustainable.
The United States has officially left the World Health Organization.
U.S. to pull out of NATO military alliance anytime?
When Trump first rode down the elevators and into American politics in 2016, one of the reasons why the American political establishment on both sides of the aisle didn't take him seriously was precisely because of his isolationism. And there was a strong view that, American voters would simply not vote for a candidate who did not take seriously the importance of American global leadership. And it turned out they were wrong. The New York Times has set this out for us very neatly. If you go back and look at the 3 elections in which Trump has stood, the vote for Trump has increased every time. This is a political phenomenon. For as far as Americans are concerned, a president who doesn't want to accept the burdens of American global leadership is fine by them. Isolationism was a very sensible policy for the United States. America is inherently a very secure country. To use Donald Trump's immortal phrase, it's surrounded by 2 big, beautiful oceans and by 2 much weaker powers. So America could be extremely confident as long as no stronger power had enough strength to project power across those oceans. People spoke, in fact, quite a lot in the 90s about America as the new Rome, the role it played being like the role that Rome had played at the height of its empire. It was a very good order. The US-led unipolar order is probably the best of all possible worlds. And that's notwithstanding the fact that America sometimes does crazy things. What we had was an order in which the United States claimed and was accorded by others in managing the international system.
In the formation of a new world organization, the United Nations.
And that had the effect of America becoming the sole global great power. Trump himself doesn't talk in these terms. America has supported the security of its allies because that's been in America's interest. It's kept that going because it thought it wasn't going to cost it anything. As we contemplate living in a multipolar world in which the United States is no longer playing the role in our security that we've been used to, the next president, broadly speaking, will either be a Democrat or a Republican. If they're a Republican, unless something really extraordinary happens, there'll be a Trump Republican. It may well be Donald Trump.
China, 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 China. People from China, they love me. Right. China.
China is now in a position to deny the United States any prospect of a conventional military victory in a war with China. If you go back to the last time the United States and China had serious military confrontation in Asia, which was in 1996, America's military position was just overwhelmingly strong. If war had broken out, America just would have won in a week. China's air and maritime capability started growing like that. And the fact is that America's let that happen. America started up there and China started down there. America's gone like that and China's gone like that. If America had responded to the growth in China's maritime and air capabilities by building up its own maritime and air capabilities, which would have required spending huge sums of money and so on, okay, that's what an effective American response would look like. But the fact is it hasn't done that. It's allowed its military position to decline. US political leaders have not been prepared to go out and bluntly tell Americans that in order to preserve their position in East Asia and the Western Pacific, they must be willing to fight a war with China. Whilst there's been lots of talk about America defending its leadership, it hasn't been prepared to do what was really necessary. And there's a very big contrast there with the Cold War. Because what America did in the Cold War when it decided to contain the Soviet Union was to engineer massive growth in American military capability. Now, you look at what's happened in Europe, what we saw when Russia moved into Crimea in 2014.
Vladimir Putin casts his shadow across the boundary of Europe and Russia. U.S. and its allies decided to push back.
America said, well, tut, you mustn't do that. But it did nothing to substantially reinforce US military forces. It posted tiny little token forces to forward positions in the Baltic states. The very tiny scale of those deployments demonstrated not that America was serious, but that it wasn't serious. If you confront Russian aggression by deploying battalions of 1,000 soldiers here and there, then you're really telling Russia the United States was not prepared to go to Russia to defend Ukraine. It couldn't defend the US-led order in Europe. And this is the big asymmetry between America's position during the Cold War and America's position today. During the Cold War, America was willing to fight a nuclear war in order to prevent the Soviet Union pushing through the boundary between them, the Iron Curtain down the middle of Europe. They were so serious about defending their position that they were willing to pay unimaginable costs of a nuclear war in order to do so. Neither side ever took the risk. The problem we have today is perfectly credible for Russia to threaten to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, knowing that the United States will not retaliate. Lots of people, when Russia invaded Ukraine, said, we must absolutely defeat Russia because that's the right thing to do. And I accept that proposition. The alternative proposition, which is, well, that will cost you a huge amount. You'll have to risk a nuclear war. The costs entailed in accepting that risk are too high to justify it. Gloomy prognosis is that the Europeans will end up conceding to Russia whatever they can't convince the Russians they're willing to fight a nuclear war to deny them. That's a very gloomy conclusion to draw for Ukraine. Is there any reason to expect that they think differently about, for example, the Baltic states? I don't think so. That's a sad thing to say. We're going to stop Russia, and in order to stop Russia, what they have to be able to do is to credibly threaten nuclear retaliation against Russia. If Europe doesn't do that collectively, then countries will have to do it individually. There is a debate in Poland at the moment about whether they need to acquire their own nuclear weapons. I'm torn on this because I really do think nuclear weapons are terrible, terrible things. And I think the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons that's been achieved since the establishment of the NPT has been a marvellous achievement. We just realistically have to recognise that a lot of countries who have not had to contemplate that question are going to have to ask this question very seriously. China is now in a position to deny the United States any prospect of a conventional military victory in a war with China. The United States cannot defeat China. If the United States wanted to reverse that, they could perhaps do it by spending 7 or 8 or 9% of GDP on defence. In order to do that, they have to persuade the American people that this is absolutely necessary. Then maybe they could again convince the American public to do that.
We don't get moving, they're going to eat our lunch.
Biden used language like, we're in the competition with China for the 21st century. Many American commentators talk as if China isn't stopped now, it will end up dominating the world. That's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen for the same reason that America no longer dominates the world. The fact is there are too many strong powers elsewhere. So I think the idea that China is going to end up going on from dominating East Asia and the Western Pacific to dominating the whole of Eurasia is very fanciful. There's no doubt that China will never grow at 10% per annum again the way it did so spectacularly for decades. When we talk about the rise of China, we're talking about China moving people from very low productivity, subsistence farming or handicraft manufacturing into factories with much higher productivity. It's just the Industrial Revolution. The only difference is it's happened on an absolutely unprecedented scale and it's happened faster. One of the consequences of that is that, like every other country going through its industrial revolution, you grow like the clappers, then you level off. The peak China idea suggests that China's gone up like that and it's going to fall away like that. No economy's ever done that. What might happen is that it just goes like that. So China's never going to grow at 10% per annum. But it doesn't have to. Even if China were to flatline today, it would still be far more powerful relative to the United States than any country has been. Therefore, the costs and risks to America of challenging China would be far, far higher than people believed they were when they believed that America was just going to be incomparably dominant for as far ahead as we can see. If you measure economy in PPP terms, which is a relevant measure, purchasing power parity, to measure which determines how much stuff you can actually buy, China's economy has been bigger than America's for a decade. The Chinese economy is here to stay. We now live in a world in which the United States no longer has the biggest economy in the world. We in the West find it extraordinarily hard to get our heads around. The idea that China was just a dumb economy putting together stuff designed in California, anyone who still thinks that has not been paying attention. China's GDP is made up of people making things, whereas America's GDP is made up of people doing financial deals or designing social media. I do think it gives China an advantage. Warfare is a very physical thing. The United States pretends to itself that it's trying to preserve a global military predominance. All China's trying to do is to stop America achieving that predominance in its own backyard. So the fact that America has to send forces into the Western Pacific and China just has to stop them doing that gives China a huge advantage. And lastly, of course, it just cares more. The balance of resolve favours China in East Asia. Those four asymmetries together, all favouring China. Taiwan is a very difficult case because China is so strong and so determined for a country of 24 million to take on a country of 1.3 billion. It has the advantage of the Taiwan Strait. It has the advantage of being an island, which does make it inherently more defensible. But it was only the fact that it was an island which meant that it didn't fall under the communists in 1949. If I can put it this way, the Taiwan Strait is not wide enough. And there's always been kind of acknowledged by the Taiwanese. It's one of the reasons why the Taiwanese have spent so little on defence. For small powers going up against great powers, what counts as a win is raising the costs and risks to the great power to the point that they don't bother. But I think the problem for Taiwan, no matter what it does, it can't raise the costs and risks high enough in view of China's imperative. Taiwan is tailor-made for blockade. And it's very easy for the Chinese to prevent any ship or aircraft approaching Taiwan. It simply says ships and aircraft can approach Taiwan from China. It does put China in an overwhelmingly powerful position. It would be extremely difficult for the Taiwanese to defeat that, but it would still be a very costly operation because, as you say, I mean, both the sea distances and the scale would be a very big deal. But I don't think that's what the Chinese need to do. I think Taiwan's position is essentially indefensible. The challenge that poses for the rest of us is how honest we are with Taiwan about the chance of us giving them support. There's quite a strong view in the US that it would be improper to come out and say out loud, now we won't help defend Taiwan, because that might encourage the Chinese. But the other side to that is that it's very improper to encourage the Taiwanese to think that we'll come to their aid if we won't. It's therefore a war which is almost certain to result either in American defeat or a nuclear exchange, because that is a very real possibility. It's a complicated calculation because, of course, you end up in a terrible game of bluff, but it's a very real risk. The United States really has three basic choices. It can resist, and then if China keeps pushing, I think a war does become inevitable. Or it can do a deal, meet China halfway, or it can cave in. Now, it's perfectly possible for a country to choose to step back to avoid war. And that's what I believe America is doing. They don't talk that way. Joe Biden 4 times came out and said that the United States would defend Taiwan.
U.S. forces, U.S. men and women, would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion.
Yes.
But nothing America has done gives one any reason to think that they're really serious about doing that. Then war won't happen. I shouldn't say won't happen, because it's always possible that war could break out, so to speak, by mistake. The United States will find itself in a position where it has to make a choice between going to war with China or stepping back. America has been making what I would see as the right decision, not spending the sums of money to reinforce a position in East Asia to defend its leadership in this region, which it doesn't need for its own purposes. But that on the night at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the crisis breaks, a president might make the wrong call and go to war anyway. It's also a risk, I think, with Trump. I don't have very high confidence in Trump's capacity to make the right call at 3 o'clock in the morning. A war against China, even with Japan's help, the United States can't win. We know what winning the war with Germany meant in the Second World War. It meant occupying Berlin. Now, here's a prediction. The United States will never occupy Beijing. It will not happen, particularly given that China has nuclear weapons that can hit American cities. Many people regard it as frankly immoral of me to reach the conclusion that Taiwan is essentially indefensible. Horrible conclusion to draw. We should not try and defend Taiwan because it's not a war we can win. People find that very offensive. I find it offensive too. And what's on the other side? We're talking about a war which we cannot win. It would quite probably be the worst war in history because it would probably go nuclear. Should we try and preserve the US-led unipolar order, or should we settle for a multipolar order? I'd much rather live in a unipolar world, but I don't think the genuine cost of trying to preserve that justifies that. Politics is the art of the possible. People don't recognise the rest of the quote. It's the art of the next best. We live in a multipolar world. We've got to make a multipolar world work. And that means accepting that countries like Russia and China are going to have a lot of influence over the way the world works. It is a pretty bad future. It's a future in which Ukraine, for example, seems likely to be subordinated to Russia. It's a future in which Taiwan is likely to be subordinated to China. It's a future in which countries like Japan, if they want to preserve their position in a Chinese-dominated region, are going to have to acquire their own nuclear weapons. It's a darker world. It's just not as dark as the world in which the United States attempts to preserve the unipolar order, because I don't think that's a competition we can win. That's what we've learned in Ukraine. America and its allies, we have not been willing to bear the costs and risks that would be required to defend Ukraine. It became clear a long time ago that Ukraine couldn't defeat Russia and push Russia out of Ukraine, even with military support from the West, from its allies. In the end, it would come down to a nuclear confrontation. It is a very difficult world to live in. It's just not as difficult as the alternative. How difficult it is to live in depends a lot on how the process of transition is managed. Japan's predicament, for example. Japan can no longer rely in the long term on America. The good news for Japan is that it easily has the capacity, the economic and technological weight to preserve its independence vis-a-vis China. I think it will need nuclear weapons. For Japan, technically it's a trivial question. North Korea having now acquired nuclear weapons, it can now impose extraordinary risks on the United States. And that does make the South very vulnerable to North Korean nuclear blackmail. And South Koreans understand this. The possibility of South Korea acquiring its own nuclear weapons has taken a sharp upward turn. I don't see what the South Koreans can do about this except to acquire their own nuclear capability. That's probably what they'll do. Europe is different. In Europe, there is at least the potential for a collective response. The most likely outcome is that Europe is going to cohere strategically as a great power in its own right. I hope that's the case. I think that's the best outcome for Europe, but I also think it's the best outcome for the rest of the world. Europe's very geographically compact. If you compare it with East Asia, for example, it's very hard hard to establish that Japan's security really depends on Australia's because we're so far apart. It's not at all hard to persuade Germany that its security depends on Poland's security. That clearly does. Europe collectively is easily strong enough to stand up to Russia, but it will need to transform itself politically. Europe has the inherent technological capacity to produce its own stuff at the leading edge of technology. So if I was the Europeans, I would be saying, no, we need to go indigenous. We need to develop a European strategic military technological capability. So, for example, get back into the business of producing our own first order, fifth generation fighter aircraft and so on. Maybe the smart thing for the Europeans is not to try and build themselves their own pattern of fifth generation fighter aircraft, but just get out of the crude fighter aircraft business altogether, start excelling in missiles and drones. That's something that Europe would be well placed to do. It is worth bearing in mind that for the last military technology has been how slow the transitions have been. We have seen a slower rate of technological change in warfare since the 1970s than we saw for most of the rest of the 20th century. I mean, if you think of what happened between the First and Second World Wars, it was unbelievable. That's not to say that this won't change. The whole idea that this won't be about the Pentagon. It will be about guys in Silicon Valley. But there still remains the question, what does it look like in practice? Is it changing kinetic warfare, or is it moving into areas of cyber warfare, which we haven't yet imagined? I think we should be very cautious about presuming that America can preserve, let alone expand, its edge over China. We've tended to underestimate China every step of the way. The question is, how much damage can America impose on China, and how much damage can China impose on America? AGI-empowered strategic effects may increase America's capacity to impose huge damage on China. I don't think it will deprive China of the capacity to impose huge damage on the United States, even if China just sticks to boring old nuclear weapons. Boring old nuclear weapons can kill 50 million Americans in an afternoon. We've got to keep going back to what nuclear weapons means. Now, maybe AGI-empowered strategic effects can do the same things to the Chinese. The question is, can it do so much more to the Chinese that it overwhelms the Chinese capacity to impose punishment on the United States with nuclear weapons? Well, that's the question. Unless it can neutralize Chinese nuclear weapons, it's not going to put America in the capacity to dictate to China. One doesn't want to be a Luddite and say none of this is going to make any difference. Anyone who lived in this business in the 1990s will remember the talk about the revolution in military affairs. The application of information and communications technology was going to fundamentally revolutionize the way battlefields work. It didn't until now, and actually really what's revolutionized it has been batteries to power drones. Drones, because they rely on battery power, have limited payloads. And in the end, they're just carrying high explosive. High explosive is not very hard to beat. You just have to spend a bit of money on steel and concrete. What we're talking here is not something broad and globalized and unstructured. It's the application of these technologies to very specific national strategic purposes. And I think America will remain an extraordinarily secure country because it will have the power and the resolve to ensure that no power intrudes on its bastion in the Western Hemisphere. America is not disappearing. It's going to remain an extraordinarily powerful state. What America needs to be is a very powerful member of a global multipolar order. And if America uses its power wisely, it can do great things. The Trump administration, for God's sake, do what you can. You accept that it's going to be a multipolar order. So help build that multipolar order. And for the most problematic group, the US foreign policy establishment, the old foreign policy establishment, let it go. Stop kidding yourself. Stop talking as if you're serious about preserving US primacy. It's extremely dangerous. It provokes without deterring. The biggest problem we face is that the US foreign policy establishment is still in love with the vision of leading the world that seemed to beckon to them in the 1990s. Let it go. Get real.